Now can you hear me? Oh, good. Now that you've all looked up the reading from John, I have to tell you there seems to be a little oops this morning because what is supposed to be the reading is listed as the sermon title. So it's excerpts from Judges chapter 7, which you won't be able to follow in your pew Bible. So today, you just get to listen. And if you're wondering, the sermon title is actually The Courage of Gideon. So, from Judges. Gideon got up early the next morning, all his troops right there with him. God said to Gideon, "You have too large an army with you. I can't turn Midian over to them like this. They'll take all the credit, saying I did it all myself, and forget about me. Make a public announcement. Anyone afraid, anyone who has any qualms at all, may leave Mount Gilead now and go home." 22 companies headed for home. 10 companies were left. God said to Gideon, "There are still too many. Take them down to the stream, and I'll make the final cut." God said to Gideon, "Everyone who laps with his tongue the way a dog laps, set on one side, and everyone who kneels to drink, drinking with his face to the water, set to the other side." God said to Gideon, "I'll use the 300 men who lapped at the stream to save you and give Midian into your hands. All the rest may go home." That night, God told Gideon, "Get up and go down to the camp. I've given it to you. If you have any doubts about going down, go down with Purah, your armor bearer. When you hear what they're saying, you'll be bold and confident." He and his armor bearer Purah went down near the place where the sentries were posted. Midian and Amalek, all the Easterners, were spread out on the plains like a swarm of locusts, and their camels, past counting like grains of sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just in time to hear a man tell a friend his dream. He said, "I had this dream. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp. It came to the tent and hit it so hard it collapsed. The tent fell." His friend said, "This has to be the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has turned Midian, the whole camp, over to him." When Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he went to his knees before God in prayer. Then he went back to the Israelite camp and said, "Get up and get going. God has just given us the Midianite army." He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. He gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch in the jar. He said, "Watch me and do what I do. When I get to the edge of camp, do exactly what I do. When I and those with me blow the trumpets, you also all around camp, blow your trumpets and shout for God and for Gideon." Gideon and his 100 men got to the edge of the camp at the beginning of middle watch, just after the sentries had been posted. They blew the trumpets, at the same time smashing the jars that they carried. All 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands, ready to blow, and shouted, "A sword for God and for Gideon." They were stationed all around the camp, each man at his post. The whole Midianite camp jumped to its feet. They yelled and fled. When the 300 blew their trumpets, God aimed each Midianite sword against his companion all over the camp. Gideon then sent messengers through all the hill country of Ephraim, urging them, "Come down against Midian, capture the fords of the Jordan at Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim rallied and captured the fords of the Jordan at Beth-barah, and they pressed the pursuit of Midian. They brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When I was young, my grandmother, a good Oklahoma Southern Methodist, often used phrases that made reference to Scripture without actually quoting it or ever explaining the reference to me, assuming that those in her hearing would understand. When she was surprised, she would often exclaim, "Land of Goshen!" It's an actual place in the Bible. And when someone did something particularly brave, especially if it didn't seem very prudent at the time, but worked out well in the end, she would refer to that person as having the courage of Gideon. There were others, of course, but those are the ones I recall hearing most often. Something recently brought that grandmother to mind, and all those little phrases that she used. I got to thinking about Gideon and how long it had been since I'd even thought about that story, much less heard anyone else talk about it. So I thought maybe it was time to revisit our buddy Gideon and find out what was so special about his particular brand of courage. See what we could learn from the story. Well, the story of Gideon is found in chapters 6 through 8 of Judges, but the main story is in chapter 7. And for those of you who don't normally go leafing through your Bible and reading random sections, the story of Gideon is great. Other sections of Judges can be a little gross, so just use a little caution. But what I read earlier is a kind of condensed version from a translation called The Message. I commend the whole section to you, or at least the chapter. It's a pretty interesting story. We're going to begin with a little background. So the Old Testament has this kind of seemingly endless looping cycle of the Israelites being obedient to God, God bestowing favor on the Israelites, them getting a little too comfortable with prosperity, them straying from the ways of the Lord, them being punished for their failure to follow God's leading, them seeking help and God's forgiveness, receiving help and forgiveness in miraculous ways, renewing commitment and obedience to God, receiving God's favor and getting too comfortable with prosperity, and the whole cycle begins again. In fact, that cycle kind of sums up most of the Old Testament. The particulars vary, but the pattern holds. Israel was in one of the punishment phases of the cycle when the Lord appeared to Gideon. He tasked Gideon with delivering Israel from its oppressors, the Midianites, a much larger and stronger and more powerful group of people. Gideon objected on the grounds of being unworthy and incompetent, a typical response of those called into direct service in God. His words are recorded in chapter 6 of Judges, and they go something like this. "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And God told Gideon to get over himself, because God would be with him. They went through the whole "God give me a sign" routine, with God accommodating fearful humanity by giving a miraculous sign, Gideon asking for another sign because one wasn't enough, and God accommodating again, and Gideon finally getting it that God wanted him to do something and he'd best get to it. Now, Gideon was not really a particularly spectacular Israelite during a time of trouble for that nation. He wasn't known for his courage in those days. But as much as he was afraid of the rest of the Israelites, and probably any other nation that came along, he was smart enough to fear the Lord more. So he was willing to do what God said. But he wanted a practice run to prove that God would help him out. God was merciful and gave Gideon a little break before having him take on the Midianites. As a practice run, God told him to tear down the visible signs of idolatry that the unfaithful Israelites had erected. And Gideon did as he was told. He did it anonymously and in the middle of the night, but he did it. Somebody told on him. But his dad, Joash, stood up for him and said that anyone who opposed the real God would be dead by morning, and if the idols were really gods anyway, they could put the poles and altars back up themselves. Fortunately for Gideon, that went well enough. So God told Gideon, get on with it. But Gideon wanted more proof. And God patiently gave Gideon the proof he needed in the form of fleece that was wet in dry circumstances one day and dry in wet circumstances the next day. And now it was time for Gideon to get going. And so we come to today's story. Gideon was supposed to gather troops and fight off the enemy Midianites. Gideon rallied all the available troops. And they started out to tackle those pesky Midianites. But God said, that's too many people. And they'll just take credit for the victory. God knows how we humans behave. We are very quick to take credit and slow to give credit. So God told Gideon to find anyone who was feeling a little nervous about it, to fight a bigger, better equipped army, and those guys could go home. Gideon did so, and 22,000 guys left. 22,000. Gideon now had about 10,000 people left. The Midianites had enough people to appear as large as a swarm of locusts. So 10,000 on Gideon's side, well, it sounds like a pretty big number, did not put the odds in the Israelites' favor by any stretch of the imagination. But God wanted to make sure that he got the credit for what was about to happen. So after all of that, with him being a self-proclaimed jealous God and knowing humans need more proof, God told Gideon to take the troops to a nearby river and have them drink. And God would tell Gideon which ones to keep and which ones to send home based on whether they lapped at the water like dogs or cupped their hands to drink. It seems kind of an odd way to separate the troops. But God separated the troops by God's own way and said, these few will fight with you and the rest will go home. He allowed Gideon 300 soldiers. He started out with 32,000 soldiers. He was allowed 300 to do battle against a whole valley full of well-equipped soldiers. This would certainly not be human ability, and God would have to receive the credit. Gideon was kind of nervous, so God said, hey, go eavesdrop on those guys over in the camp. It was then God proved his faithfulness by having Gideon overhear the dream of this Midianite soldier, a dream that involved a barley cake knocking down an entire tent. People had weird dreams back then, just like we do now, but they actually put stock in them. So there was an interpretation of the dream. Victory by the sword of Gideon. This told Gideon all he needed to know. God would use these few men, likened to a barley cake, to conquer a great army, much like a whole tent. And with some bizarre instructions about jars and torches and trumpets, that's exactly what the Lord did through Gideon. 300 men overcame an entire valley full of soldiers, not with fierce weapons and machinery, but with household objects and musical instruments. The Israelites didn't turn their sword on their enemy at all. God had the Midianites turn their swords on each other. That's a pretty impressive display of God's great power, and it kept the Israelites innocent of bloodshed. Gideon went on to call out a few other nations over whom the Israelites also triumphed with the help of God. Of course, in the end, a few chapters on, the Israelites got too comfortable and the whole cycle started over again, but for a while things were pretty good and peace reigned for 40 years. Gideon got credit for his great courage. But when you think about the story, he really wasn't very brave about fighting an enemy. He protested against God's instructions. He capitulated only after God gave him miraculous signs. He requested and received proof of God's power before being even willing to gather the army. And then he wanted additional reassurance before going into battle. If God came to us and spoke to us and gave us miraculous signs and promised to be with us, we'd be much more courageous, right? Yet isn't that exactly what God has done? He sent angels announcing the birth of the Messiah. He came to humanity in the person and work of Jesus Christ. He speaks through the scriptures. He gives us miraculous signs that we can read about over and over. And he promises to be with us always, adopting us into his very own family at our baptism and assuring us regularly of his presence, not only here on earth, but in life in heaven to come. We have everything Gideon had and far more. Are we willing to be as brave as he was? Trusting God and taking on the establishment even when we are vastly outnumbered? Are we willing to believe, as Gideon did, that God is with us in a personal and physical way, guiding our steps, leading where God would have us go, even when what we are headed for seems impossible? Are we willing to be generous with others, giving up more than seems reasonable and trusting that God will still provide for our needs? Do we recognize and trust the signs that God gives us in life, giving God credit when things are figured out? Are we willing to complete the first tasks assigned and then in victory to continue to labor on? If we're willing to at least try to do these things, then we are showing forth the faith we claim. Showing forth the faith that, as it says in the Hebrews passage that Norma read us this morning, faith that is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. If we are willing to trust in the Lord, then we will find ourselves in a long line of faithful servants who labored on as long as God called them and who were rewarded at their end. And here's the best part. We don't have to be perfect to be remembered as courageous soldiers in the faith. We just have to be willing to be brave enough to trust in the Lord, even if we have to ask for a little sign here and there, and to labor on God's behalf. Gideon was not a brave man by human standards, and the victory over the Midianites didn't really belong to Gideon anyway. Gideon's courage was the courage to faithfully follow where the Lord led, to be willing to ask God for what he needed, and to trust the Lord's might and provision even when the odds were stacked against him. That's the courage of Gideon. It's not the courage of a soldier, but the courage of a faithful man who admitted his humanity and his fears, who asked for help, and who trusted God. May we all be as courageous as Gideon was.